This is a legal panel, so we'll kind of geek out on all legal stuff with our expert panels here. We have Justin from KNL. We have Stan here from Founders Legal, and we have Zack from Venture Counsel. I'll let them introduce themselves, but very quickly, I'm Jagruti. I'm the CFO at Bitpay. Prior to joining Bitpay, I was an audit partner at a top-tier CPA firm based here in Atlanta. Been involved in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space since about 2014, when I didn't really realize, I guess, the reason I got into it was I was very skeptical about, someone creating a digital asset called Bitcoin out of thin air and then doing something with it. And then, fast forward, here I am now, all into the space. But again, you're here to listen to a bunch of experts here talking about legal regulatory landscape in the crypto space. These guys have been practicing, not just passionate in the blockchain crypto space, but also practicing in the space for quite some time. So with that, maybe Justin, I'll kick off with you. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Justin Wales. I'm a partner at a law firm called KNL Gates. Since 2014, I've run this firm and my prior firm's blockchain and virtual currency practice, what we call it. We represent quite a bit of infrastructure in the space. So this is everything from mining operations to international exchanges. Over the last several years, we've done quite a bit of work, actually in like DeFi, where I think most of the really avant-garde legal issues are. But I'm what I call myself a friendly maximalist. So I'm happy to be here, but I dabble in shitcoinery as well.
Hi, my name is Zack Shapiro. I've got my own sort of small practice. The bulk of my work is fractional general counsel services for startups, all sorts of startups, but a lot of them in the crypto space as well. And then I've got a specialized practice in crypto securities law, also in the broader shitcoin universe. Trying to think about what kinds of assets are or not securities, and I help exchanges and funds and sort of anyone who has an interest in that think about these questions.
Hi, my name is Stan Sater. I'm with Founders Legal. So part of my practice in the corporate group where we focus on general outside counsel type work, and I also specialize in data privacy in this space. Yeah, we dabble a little bit with shitcoinery too. But represent developers and other founders building products in the space as well.
Okay, well, great. Thank you for being here. With that, I'm going to start with a question, Justin. Actually, I had for you, starting with you, and then the rest of you guys jump in. In one of your recent publications, you talk about Bitcoin and its use cases in the as a protocol network, right? And then you kind of recommend a framework on how the First Amendment could be applied to Bitcoin and other emerging technologies. So to that extent, what do you think, in your opinion, U.S. Constitution today has to protect Bitcoiners?
Sure. Well, it's a somewhat complicated political topic because if you look at the hierarchy of laws, obviously on top, at least from a U.S. perspective, is the U.S. Constitution. So the best way to challenge a law is on a constitutional basis. So in 2019, I wrote a law review article that goes through and creates a framework for how we might think of the First Amendment implications of Bitcoin and other decentralized networks. It was called Bitcoin as Speech. And if you were here, I think TABConf 2019, I gave a presentation. You can Google it. And kind of hear the entire argument. The challenge is, just last night, the infrastructure bill passed, and there are arguably unconstitutional provisions, if enacted, on reporting. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment related to Bitcoin. I don't know if anyone's watched Succession, the series, right? But something was said in the last episode that really kind of stuck with me, and it was Logan was said, threatened with indictment. Then he wanted to do something. He goes, but what about the law? And he said, the law is people, and people is politics. And I think that's fundamentally true. So we have a lot of arguments about Bitcoin is an associational network. It is a censorship-resistant publication tool. There's a lot of things, these transactions are expressive as much as they are financial, right? However, the challenge is that you need to convince a judge of that at some point, and if you are at the point where you are making these arguments, you have potentially lost the game. An example of this is we have the BSA, the Bank Secrecy Act. And the Bank Secrecy Act under the Fourth Amendment and also under the First Amendment was challenged for years. And as a result of these challenges, where we had really great arguments that the Bank Secrecy Act violated the First Amendment, it violated the Fourth Amendment, what happened is the Supreme Court created the third-party doctrine, which basically says, no, 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 no. If you voluntarily give your information to a bank, the bank can just go and give it to the government. So we want to be very thoughtful in how we present these defenses, because you don't necessarily want to challenge them. You want to be able to stop them politically before you need to challenge them. The failure in some ways with the infrastructure bill is we have a lot of great arguments, and now it passed anyway, and we either can fix them through an amendment process over the next 2 years, and maybe Coin Center and all the advocacy groups will be able to do that, or we have to take them to court. And I'm insecure about our chances if this ends up getting to the highest courts.
Completely. What are your thoughts?
So I think I broadly agree with that, but I do think it's important to think about what these arguments would be and to make them in as robust a way as possible. And I think there are some things about Bitcoin that are fundamentally different than other types of transactions. So if you're dropping off $15,000 in cash at the bank, and that's reported under the Bank Secrecy Act, what information are you giving? Well, okay, you're talking about this transaction that doesn't sort of dox your whole financial history. In the same way, if you have to report on-chain transactions and you don't have good OPSEC, you're not using privacy tools, you can learn a lot about someone based on this type of reporting. And so one of the concepts I sort of like from the law that maybe we can use in this space is the Mosaic Theory, and the famous Supreme Court case where if you've got a GPS and that's pinging data to a third-party satellite provider, that might be something that would fall under the third-party doctrine itself. But if there's enough of this data over time, that creates a mosaic of information about you that is intimate in a way that the Fourth Amendment can apply. And so I think there are some of these concepts we can maybe port over into Bitcoin to make these arguments robust.
Yeah, and with the fourth party doctrine, it's interesting. There was a case in 2020 out of the Fifth Circuit that basically, piggybacking off the previous Bank Secrecy Act Fourth Amendment arguments, this guy was challenging the third party doctrine with respect to his Coinbase transactions, and the court basically looked at it and said, Coinbase is a financial institution regulated by the Bank Secrecy Act. They look like a bank. These transactions look like you're just making transactions like you are with a bank. You have discretion with respect to the exchanges that you use. You voluntarily use them like you voluntarily use your bank, and therefore, we can get your transaction data from Coinbase. And so, I think there's a lot of things that people are choosing to use out of convenience in the space that might hinder some of those constitutional arguments. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done, especially with the infrastructure bill, in terms of figuring out, either through amendment, what certain provisions in there mean. Like, what does it mean to effectuate a transaction, which maybe we can more about.
What do you think it means?
I mean, so, the Coinbases of the world, absolutely, I think, effectuate transactions. But, with respect to, does that work for Bitcoin Node or Lightning Node, channel operators, things like that? I think that's like something maybe, probably isn't the best to take to court, because then you've got to explain it to a judge, and it's kind of, subject to even more discretion than something that can be negotiated.
So, in that article I wrote, I go through the different, stakeholders in like a Bitcoin transaction, right? So obviously, if it's something like Coinbase, Coinbase is akin to a bank in a lot of ways, and I don't think anyone really challenges that notion, right? Like they're basically subject to the same types of regulations. Exchange is similar. When you're talking about nodes and you're talking about miners, in my view, they're really expressing more of an associational commitment to the Bitcoin network than a financial one, right? So, for instance, there are many reasons why I run a node. I have no financial interest in. Like, I don't get anything out of it. It's probably a net loss at the end of the day. But like, it makes me feel good, and so I'm not embarrassed when I talk to my friends that I'm not the only one who's not doing it, right? So, am I effectuating transactions? Well, maybe not effectuating, but I'm certainly participating. But I'm doing it for associational reasons, right? I think you can say the same thing about miners, right? The miners are there partially to potentially get mining rewards, but why else? Is that they're trying to support this broad network. Well, that in and of itself is a political act, right? The participation is a political act. So I think when you get to those type of, like, I would say non-financial stakeholders, even though there might be a financial element, they're non-financial stakeholders, there are much better constitutional arguments than when you are in the middle of a transaction. And that's typically in, like, most states, how, like, the money transmission rules have been processed. Is like, are you sitting in the middle of a transaction, or are you getting, like, a vig on both sides? If the answer is yes, typically we think, okay, you need to get regulated in the same way that other financial intermediaries. What you're actually seeing, though, is that in some states that's starting to change. So Florida is, like, a good example. Florida is a bad example for almost everything, but it's a good example for this bad example, which is it used to be, and I've worked a lot with the OFR in Florida, that in order for you to be licensed in Florida, you need to stand in the middle of a transaction and act as a third party. Some person got arrested, this guy named Mitchell Espinoza got arrested years ago for money laundering and some other bad acts. And because of that case, it kind of, like, went up and down the Florida appellate court for a while, and the appellate court said, no, under a strict reading of the law, just selling any Bitcoin is money transmission, you need a license. Now, the Office of Financial Regulation never took this position at all. They took the position that you don't need a license just for simple sales of Bitcoin. That's why if you had a Bitcoin ATM company in Florida, you didn't need a money transmission license. Because it went through the court system, and we had a competing case that decided something different than the agency. A lawyer a couple months ago basically asked the agency, and was trying to be clever, and said, hey, confirm that you still don't require a license. And it tied the hands of the agency, and they said, look, there's a Supreme Court case on point in Florida. You now need a license. So as a result, in Florida, you need a license just to simply sell Bitcoin. I think because Florida is taking that position, and I've had conversations with other regulators, that's sort of how things are turning, because there's a fundamental concern about cryptocurrencies. And what the regulators think is that it's their view to regulate every type of transaction. And what that ends up meaning is not really to protect the consumers, which is what you think it should mean, but it's how can we secrete as much information out of each transaction to give the Department of Justice or state, criminal investigators information to, like, create a mosaic in some ways, if you will, right, of who these people are and who has Bitcoin and how can we tax them and how can we find out what's going on the network.
Yeah, I think part of the concern there as well, and this also applies in the securities space, which we might talk about in a bit, regulators are a little bit worried about innovation in the space, right? And they don't really understand the technology. And one of the things that they're concerned about is, having very clear guidance that can just get innovated around by someone who builds a protocol that uses a legal loophole. And I think, both in some of the money transmitter stuff, and certainly in for example, the SEC's specific views on how the Howey test applies to digital assets, I think they're sort of taking a wait-and-see approach. And despite what Gary Gensler says about it being perfectly clear how this applies to everything, I think there is purposefully some gray area on how some of these elements get hashed out.
So to that point, obviously Bitcoin is not a security. What needs to be done to keep it that way? Right? Given that now we have DeFi, Bitcoin ETFs. I mean, there's a lot that's happening that could, I guess, potentially challenge the position to some extent. So what are your thoughts on why Bitcoin, number one, is a security, and what needs to be done to keep it that way?
Yeah, so just very quickly to make sure we're sort of all on the same page about how something is or is not a security. A lot of this comes from the Howey test, which a a lot of people here might have heard of. It comes from a Supreme Court case from 1946 involving orange groves. And part of the reason why it's interesting to think about this starting from orange groves is the Howey test doesn't directly ask, is an asset a security or an investment contract, is the sort of legal word for it, or not. It's, is the offer and sale of any kind of asset, whether it's an orange grove or, gold bars or whiskey casks as a famous example, or any of these digital assets, an investment contract. And sort of a cartoon version, I'm simplifying it, of the Howey test asks, is someone investing money in the asset? Now, that is very broadly defined. There is now a lot of case law in the crypto space that says, it's not just spending fiat, it's trading another asset, being a liquidity provider. There are some cases even with airdrops where that's considered an investment of money, so that's almost always going to be met. Are you investing money in the expectation of profit as opposed to, for consumptive utility? This is why you hear a lot about utility tokens. This was a very popular argument in 2017, 2018. And then is your investment in the expectation of profit based on the managerial efforts of particular others, or the essential managerial efforts of particular others? And that's a lot of sort of what's issue right now in DeFi, where there are protocols that say, okay, we want to be totally decentralized. We're a decentralized exchange. We're a decentralized protocol. There's no particular others who need to do work to make the investment pay off. And I think this is going to be a really interesting test for decentralization. And so as more things get built onto Bitcoin that could look like securities, I think one of the interesting questions is, Bitcoin, which doesn't have a company, we don't even know who the original leader was. That person left the project. I think things that look more like that might be treated more favorably under the Howey test than a lot of what we're seeing in the broader crypto world right now, where things claim to be decentralized and maybe they're not as decentralized as they say they are.
I mean, I think as well it's important to keep in mind that like a security isn't just an investment contract. There's a plethora of things behind that definition, such as certificates of indebtedness, notes, warrants, other things like that. So, even the SEC is very clear repeatedly that Bitcoin isn't a security. You can still do things to make what you are selling that's involved in Bitcoin a security. You can securitize Bitcoin, maybe certain wrapping things, and you're creating investment contracts based on the use of it.
I think there's 0% chance that Bitcoin will be deemed a security at some point in the future. I think it's like, that issue has long been settled. And as soon as the SEC said it wasn't, my brain stopped thinking about why is that the case, and I moved on to something more pressing.
Which is like the infrastructure bill, right? Like the one that got passed yesterday, lots to think about there. So maybe kind of switching gears to what's coming now that the bill is passed, right? Like how is it going to change the way companies are doing what they are doing today in the crypto space? Or would they, like, given the definition of what qualifies as a broker to begin with? Maybe you want to just talk about, what do you think about who falls under this infrastructure bill as a broker, and then what's coming with it?
Sure. I'm trying to visual about this. I think a lot of the discourse on Twitter, which is really what, I think we're probably most familiar with, like hot takes from Coin Center and things like that, right? And I think like they're doing a lot of great work, but in some ways we're reading the infrastructure bill as what is the worst possible interpretation of of the bill. So you read it and you think, oh, well, does this really apply to software programmers? Does it really apply to node operators? Does it really apply to miners? And it's like, maybe, technically, in like some reading of it. But I don't know from like Treasury if Treasury is actually viewing that. So it might be that a big portion of the infrastructure bill doesn't necessarily pose that big of a threat in practice. Because it'll be potentially amended, and it also, like, there will be guidance and interpretations from the agencies themselves. And the agencies have pretty much said, look, we only think, they kind of use some circular reason, but they said, we only think that brokers should be viewed as brokers. I was like, okay, what does that mean? But it doesn't seem like they're really trying to capture, like, someone, running a node. there are provisions in the infrastructure bill that also potentially require those who are doing large cryptocurrency transactions to file reports. That's also being challenged. There's the real issue is the government at worst is trying to pass regulations that individuals and businesses may not have the information needed to comply with. So a law like that just isn't possible. So if you kind of like take this to like the furthest extent, the law passes, you are involved in a transaction, the government says you didn't provide this information, and your response is, I don't have that information. I couldn't technologically have that information. That's a pretty good argument that the law might have some fundamental flaws and can be challenged. What I will say, though, is that there will never cease to be a desire by the government to get more information. So what does that mean? It means that there's probably some degree of incentive for people to self-custody a little more, so you don't have to deal with a third-party doctrine. Maybe 100% self-custody is not appropriate for everyone under every circumstance, but certainly if you want to have some financial privacy, it's required. It also means that we as an industry need to lean more towards decentralization, right? If you can't technologically comply with something, then it's very hard to say that you didn't comply with something. And then the other thing I would just say to like a Bitcoin-centric community is most of the law is being developed on the Ethereum side. So it's imperative on us, I think, in some ways, to support their efforts to retain financial privacy, because ultimately a court or Congress are going to be looking at decisions that are being made on that side and are going to say, what lessons can we learn and then apply to crypto more broadly, right? So it's all really the same fight. But I mean, that's sort of my broad thoughts on the infrastructure situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the definition now, the way it's passed, traditionally in other areas where it's not clear, it's either through interpretive guidance or, to go back out and go, these are, specific exemptions. So you're in this bucket unless an exemption applies. So that might be a route forward, especially for Bitcoin, where a lot of this stuff isn't, being produced on the fly like it is on Ethereum and other chains. Talking about what are traditional intermediaries in the space. What does it mean to self-custody? Like, do these people actually have the information to comply with, what the law says and also the spirit of this law and what you're trying to accomplish? Because this infrastructure bill, this tax provision, was pitched as a revenue offset, a way to get some, I think, like $26 or $28 billion in unrealized tax revenue. So it might be the case that, if just through explaining certain transactions, they don't fit the intended goal of like tax dodgers.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add on the broker definition, but I just think one other lesson to draw from the whole saga of the infrastructure bill is it's amazing sort of how much of a voice we had in a really important piece of legislation where there are competing amendments. You have the White House weighing in. And I think that one of the real lessons to draw from this is that we should continue to think about how we get our voice heard, whether that's through lobbying efforts, whether that's through social media campaigns. But those efforts are not in vain, and we can make a real political impact if we choose to.
No, and what's also interesting is how far along regulators have come in understanding, the space itself, right? And how much more they have to go. The whole DeFi space, and think about information gathering for people in the DeFi space. Like, how do you realistically speak? So that's interesting.
Can I just say one other
Sure.
lesson that I took away from the infrastructure fight? So there's a lot of credit rightfully given to like the lobbying side, the inside baseball that the industry is playing. And I think they're doing a lot of really great work in putting out policy. But the reason why we got to where we are, even just in this infrastructure bill, is because like the Twitter army like ramped up engagements. There was like, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of phone calls to senators. So what it tells me is that the Atlanta Bitcoin meetup, right, meets once a week in Atlanta, right? We have one in LA, we have one in Miami, we have one all over the place. Those are incredibly powerful political organizations. And if you can start to mobilize this network of developer meetings, just, crypto meetups, and creating a network where once something like this happens, we get a little notice, we can go and channel thousands and thousands of calls to senators, that prevents these types of bills from getting too far along. This was an odd case because it was just part of a giant
broader,
infrastructure
right.
bill, but there's going to be more. And I think one of things that I've been working on is how do we actually create a mobilized political network, one, and two, we need to, as an industry, ask for better media coverage, right? Because I'm involved in a lot of this, and most of the information that I was getting came from Jerry Brito and Jake Travinsky's Twitter account, and that's really great on them, but a complete failure of CoinDesk for not providing actual up-to-date coverage. So if we are just better informed on what's happening, and also we mobilize the existing networks, a lot of these kind of heady arguments of what is constitutional, what is not, we just won't have to make them, and all of our lives will be better.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, it just shows who has the power to make that difference, right? It's the people who are in the space. And
Power to the people.
yeah, exactly. Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about taxes, fun stuff. Several years back, I believe back in 2014, IRS clearly made it very clear the whole 1031 exchange is not going to apply for cryptos, right? So I think all of us, everyone, are way past that point. But there's a lot happening in the space, in the DeFi world, in NFTs, right? And then now you have different tax considerations that you need to be thinking about from, depending on who you are. Are you the NFT holder? Are you the NFT creator? Are you the, NFT buyer, etc.? So I guess I'll just keep it really broad, but what is your take on tax implications on, let's just talk about Bitcoin, right? Buying, selling, swapping, transferring, or even, investing Bitcoin to earn yield. Who wants to start?
I think in terms of tax, they came out and said it's property. I think the biggest thing that would go a long way is just a de minimis tax exemption that's the same as any sort of foreign currency. And they've proposed bills in the House, and it's kind of gone back and forth about what that amount should be, $200, $600, to think through how it gets gamed by other people. But I think definitely a lot of behavior follows tax, especially when you're talking about something like Bitcoin, where you could have sizable capital gains. And do you really want to figure out how much your capital gains or losses when you're, it's a trite example, but buying a cup of coffee? If you're trying to actually use this stuff in commerce, and every time you make a purchase, you got to figure out, jump through all the hoops of how much did I make, when did I buy it, and then, log that information, and hopefully, you're making your tax returns correct.
In some ways, I think that tax policy has done a good job of forcing Bitcoiners to consider loans, so you don't have to incur a capital gains hit. In retrospect, it was pretty brilliant of the U.S. to effectively hinder Bitcoin's use as a day-to-day currency by saying it's property. One of the questions I think that is still open is we have El Salvador accepting it as legal tender. There are rumors that Brazil is contemplating the same thing. I'm sure other countries as well. At what point is Bitcoin's use as an international currency enough to change that position, and essentially Bitcoin is treated as a as a foreign currency, right? You still have to. There's still tax policies around foreign currencies, but that to me is the open question. But it's very difficult to justify selling your Bitcoin anyway, let alone selling it and then having to pay capital gains on a macchiato.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if one of the precipitating factors for figuring that out is not just going to be the countries that adopt Bitcoin, like El Salvador did, but the proliferation of CBDCs around the world. Because we are probably moving towards a world that might have some scary elements to it, where people are using digital currencies that are very much unlike Bitcoin in their properties, that have a tremendous amount of state control in terms of surveillance, in terms of issuance, in terms of restrictions that can be put on them. And China's one of the sort of leaders in that space. I think that is going to move the conversation forward in what it means to have a digital currency. And I actually think a lot of that is going to be good for Bitcoin in general and good for people's understanding of Bitcoin in contrast to these sort of state-backed coins that are coming. But that will, I think, kick the conversation into a different gear.
I saw a meme, and it was like a flow chart, and it says, is this good for Bitcoin? And the only answer was yes, right? So like when you're dealing with like something that is inevitable, like I really believe it'll get worked out. Like if we're all correct, like it's like asking someone who's in a cult, like, is your cult a cult? It's like, no, of course not. If we're all correct in what we believe, that Bitcoin is inevitable, it is going up only, it is going to be a world reserve asset, and it is also the best and most efficient payment network and communicative tool that has ever existed, then the tax issues will end up working themselves out. But we're just at this stage now where it's like high growth. We're dealing with traditional banking, traditional finance, traditional tax laws. But I'm very optimistic in the long run that the fact that it's treated as property now, what does that mean for like my coffee purchases in the future? We can work these things out, I think. We've already done the hardest part, which was create it.
Yeah, exactly. And then you add complexities like, say, for example, you're now swapping a Bitcoin for WBTC to deploy your WBTC in a DeFi platform or protocol, right? I mean, in a way, there is a tax implication to that, right? There could be an argument made that you just sold your BTC to get WBTC because, even though that's BTC, it's a derivative on another blockchain protocol. What are your thoughts on, and again, I know there's no real tax guidance on any of these newer ways, I guess, creative ways to invest or deploy your assets in DeFi, but any kind of, advice you have for people here doing something of that sort?
I mean, definitely not advice. I have a friend who calls WBTC not Bitcoin. And I think a lot of us take that position. So like, from like a technical perspective, like you're saying it's wrapped Bitcoin, but it's a different token. So if you're just looking at like the guidance we have, it looks like if you're going from Bitcoin to selling it for wrapped Bitcoin, you have to take a capital gains hit. Right. It would be interesting to like actually suss out some of these with the IRS and different agencies and say, is that really the intent of the tax code? So if I'm just doing it as an experiment, I'm taking my Bitcoin and I'm mad at the Bitcoin network and I want it to live on the Ethereum network and I'm just still hodling, but it's wrapped Bitcoin. Maybe like from a policy perspective, that's not what the IRS is trying to get at, but really what's happening is I have Bitcoin and I'm wrapping it or what have you, and I'm now engaged in all sorts of financial transactions through DeFi, and that is specifically what the IRS is trying to get at. So I think at the end of the day, probably have to pay capital gains tax if you're honest about it.
Yeah, I would agree. All right, we have 5 minutes. Do you guys have anything to add about, I guess, on the tax side?
I think with the Bitcoin a lot settled, I mean, the SEC settled, CFTC, there's a lot of derivatives products. So once the tax issues kind of get settled as well, I think it's just sailing for Bitcoin.
I just am a joke, but I was on I saw on LinkedIn last night that someone who was like anonymous but said someone from IRS enforcement viewed your profile. And I was like, oh, what am I saying?
Yeah. I think this is another area once we get into the what happens when you wrap an asset or stake an asset or any of these things that you may want to do with your Bitcoin or may not want to do. This is another area where we may have a letter of the law, spirit of the law divergence, where, what is the difference between, minting wrapped BTC versus trading Bitcoin for wrapped BTC. And, I think it'll be interesting to see the way this plays out as people who are the developers in the space get creative based on the guidance that comes out.
So I guess on a last question, so from a legal regulatory side, what do you think is coming that we didn't talk about today, or what do you think that we should be kind of following closely and just monitoring outside of the infrastructure bill and a few things we spoke about today?
Sure. Our entire, from a federal level, our legislative process is completely broken. So the insecurity that we're seeing from the different agencies comes from our inability in Congress to pass legislation quickly. So what ends up happening is we have like a regime of regulation by enforcement. So you have the SEC going after different theories and pursuing different theories, and that's sort of their role, and they're saying, well, Bitcoin investment accounts are securities. Okay, these types of tokens are securities. Name what have you. XRP is a security. And because we don't know exactly where that line is, the SEC is kind of saying two things. First is they're saying, if you think there is a line, Gary Gensler said this the other day, if you think there is a line, just stay way back behind the line. And that's really a change in how our judicial system works, right? The way our judicial system works is the government tells us where the line is, and if it's not clear, you go to a lawyer and you say, okay, how can I get as close to the line as possible without going over? He's saying there's something nefarious about that, which I disagree with. For like the XRP case, it's like actually really interesting because they took the position that XRP is a security. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? And XRP is basically saying justify that. So they're spending lots and lots of money trying to figure out, okay, you said Ethereum is not a security. We have a lot of similarities to the way Ethereum kind of decentralized and developed and was issued. And maybe some that are even more in our favor for it not being a security. Where is that line? And that's actually like a really interesting fight because this is like the test of regulation by enforcement because a court at some point is going to decide whether XRP is or isn't a security. And as soon as that happens, one way or the other, you're going to see all of the state securities agencies, money transmission regimes, SEC, CFTC start to say, okay, we have some guidance because God knows Congress isn't giving us any. Now let's go and build enforcement from that. So my view is, as soon as we get like a major court case, then regulation will end up following because they're just not able to pass affirmative guidance on their own.
So my biggest concern sort of going forward on the regulation side is that there is going to be a divergence of interests in the Bitcoin community between people for whom Bitcoin is a really important expressive associational tool, right? The sort of freedom money folks, the privacy maximalists on the one side, and then the folks who are mostly interested in number go up on the other. And I think that one of the conversations that we should start having as a community is sort of where is the line, right? What is the hill we want to die on? What regulations are going to be healthy and what should we really try and push back on, whether that's banning coin joins, banning self-custody, what kind of regulations might there be, the Michael Saylors of the world on one side and the Matt Odells on the other. And I think the way that may play out is you're going to have highly regulated entities, conforming to stricter and stricter laws, maybe like Coinbases of the world, and then you're going to have DEXs who are out there trying to do their own thing outside of the legal system. And we're going to have to navigate those two worlds.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'm definitely watching more is the language being used and the sort of connections being made between legislators and regulators. For example, Gary Gensler used the phrase, "We need a cop on the beat." There's only one politician that I've ever heard has used that same phrase with respect to financial markets, and that's Elizabeth Warren. So I think we need to pay attention more to the language being used in those sorts of public interactions. And then on the CFTC as well, with all these Bitcoin derivatives products being traded, they haven't really come down on the Bitcoin spot market, which is very unusual for the way that other commodities are traded on the market. The CFTC has a pretty tight control over the spot market as well as derivatives.
Well, this was very informational. Thank you so much for your time. I think we may have a minute or two. Any questions anyone wants to ask? Questions? Go ahead. I think right now capital gain tax rate is about 21%. But that said, it depends. So if you're swapping Bitcoin for something else, I mean, technically you are triggering capital gain there too. So you need not be selling just Bitcoin. You could also be engaging into transferring to something else or converting to WBTC or, swapping.
You also have like state. I mean, if you're depending on what state, you'll have state rates as well. If you don't have a capital gains, you don't have to declare capital gains. But the IRS is now asking you to declare whether you do or don't have crypto, generally. So they're keeping a list somewhere.
Although I do think on the FAQ on that form, they did say you do not have to check the yes box if you have only bought and held.
Right. But I think doesn't it say that, maybe I'm incorrect, but doesn't it say that if you've acquired it over the last year?
That's what the language says.
Yeah, okay,
That's
yeah,
the last
okay.
one,
Yeah.
Do you have to pay any capital gains or taxes if you transfer your Bitcoin to, let's say if I give my grandma a Bitcoin,
So you're talking about gifting?
Gifting, yeah.
I'm not a tax expert, but anyone here a tax expert? I'm an accounting and...
Or let's say if I give my mom a Bitcoin or my brother.
So you would follow gift tax laws at that point, and I'm not an expert, but I do know the value that matters is the fair value as of the date of transfer. So you bought the Bitcoin at $5 or whatever, and today it's like $60,000. You're transferring today at $60K. She will definitely not be paying taxes. She's getting an asset worth $60,000. You're disposing of an asset worth $60,000. I believe you do trigger, taxes on the difference between basis and you disposing of the asset. But again, not a gift tax expert. It's a question for someone in the tax side.
What do you think about this bullshit they're talking about of taxing unrealized capital gains?
It's insane, right? I mean, it's just like the craziest thing in the world.
How do you track it?
It's not even that. It's like
Going back to the UK at that point. I'll find somewhere to go.
Here's really the problem. It's not even like the logistics of doing it. It's telling you that the risk that you took should in some way be punished. Right? I saw a thing online the other day, and it said it's not life-changing money unless you change your life with it, right? So at some point, you're going to sell your Bitcoin, you're going to do something, and you're going to buy a nice house, you're going to live a good life. And the idea that you should be penalized for still holding on to something, or they're not really talking about it in the context of crypto. They're talking about it in terms of like a CEO has a high equity stake in the business they're building. But you don't necessarily want to incentivize CEOs to have to be forced to sell the equity in the company they're building to what is likely private equity or investors. So to me, it's incredibly anti-business. I can't see a world where that is easily passed politically, and I think it is just a few politicians going on like MSNBCs and talking.
Yeah, I think it also may well be constitutionally dubious, right? You hear language around unrealized capital gains income, maybe trying to shoehorn this into the 16th Amendment, but we'll see how that goes. I personally am very excited to declare all my unrealized capital losses when we're in the bear market.
We'll all take that.
Okay. So the SEC has declared that Bitcoin and Ethereum are essentially currencies. So if I were to use my Bitcoin, say in El Salvador, as a medium of exchange, why would it necessarily be taxed as an asset class? Wouldn't it be a currency that I could use?
Well, they didn't say that they're currencies. They said that they aren't securities. And then you have the IRS, which says that they're property. So if they said that they are currencies and they're treating this as just any sort of foreign currency, that would be, great for all of us. It's unfortunate, but we have overlapping regimes. So you have the SEC and sometimes the CFTC and sometimes state money transmission regulators and then also the IRS all having an independent assessment of what is or is not Bitcoin. And unfortunately, sometimes it creates a situation where it's a commodity. We might use it as a currency, and it might be a really great currency, but from a U.S. perspective, they don't view it as a currency in the same way they view, a peso or, a pound.
Quickly, we're out of time.
Oh, okay. Well, just quick follow-up question. How do you feel about the future in terms of them establishing law? Let's say it goes to the Supreme Court, because I don't see any engineers, any computer programmers, any computer scientists in any position that they would be making that decision.
I think the effort behind the infrastructure bill is pretty telling of how the space can quickly make an impact and get mainstream media attention, as well as the attention of their congressmen and representatives to really sit down and think and engage with people in the community.
I'm overall very optimistic and positive about everything. And I will say from talking to I talk to regulators every single day. And the regulators I speak to who are not agency heads are all pretty knowledgeable about Bitcoin and crypto. They're pretty positive about it. They see it as inevitable. They think that there should be some rules around it. It's really just at the highest political levels that there's a concern. Mm-hmm. And I think what that means is as you see this next generation sort of come into power, I think things will ease up a bit.
Yeah, I'd just say briefly to close on this, the story of the last decade or so of Bitcoin is about a new legitimate asset class coming into existence. And you see that reflected in society, the way people talk about Bitcoin. You also see it reflected in the price, right? I don't think it is a coincidence that the two most recent all-time highs we've had, one was around the listing of Coinbase, right, with a lot of fanfare. And then the other was in the SEC approval of a futures ETF. And so I'm excited to see, with Bitcoin becoming an increasingly, in the views of the public and not just us crazy people, a legitimate asset class, where we're going to go.
Well, thank you everyone for the panel. It was great information.